7 years. That was the amount of time the 1967 Mustang had remained forgotten in the city impound lot. Its tires had collapsed into the pavement, the paint had been worn away by weather and neglect, and nobody had ever come looking for it. No claims, no disputes, no paperwork tying it to anyone. When Owen Mercer purchased it at the minimum auction bid, he did so because something he couldn't quite identify made him stop and take a second look. He wasn't searching for purpose. He was searching for profit. Yet the moment his hands reached the instrument cluster and his fingers brushed against a section that clearly didn't belong, everything changed. Someone had concealed something inside that vehicle. Someone had died before they were able to tell their wife where it was hidden. What Owen didn't know was that the car had chosen him long before he ever laid eyes on it. Mercer Automotive occupied 4 service bays at the far end of a fading industrial strip on Hartwell's western edge, in a neighborhood the city had quietly stopped caring about years ago. The streetlights near the eastern intersection still flickered during cold mornings. The faded curb markings hadn't seen fresh paint since before Owen opened his business. The shop sign hung above the entrance, hand-painted in dark blue lettering across a rough pine board. Owen had made it himself during the first week he opened, using nothing more than a steady hand and a can of outdoor enamel paint. 5 winters later, it still looked respectable. Inside, the concrete floor carried decades of oil stains layered over one another. The patterns no longer resembled accidental spills. They looked permanent, like maps. Like a record of every repair ever completed within those walls, every leak caught, every vehicle fixed, every long night spent solving problems no one else wanted. His only employee was Jonah, a 20-year-old part-time assistant who showed up 4 days a week without being reminded. More importantly, Jonah possessed something increasingly uncommon: curiosity. He wasn't interested only in learning procedures. He wanted to understand why those procedures worked. Over time, Owen had come to appreciate that distinction. The shop wasn't struggling. It simply functioned the way honest small businesses often do. The bills were paid, the loan payments were made, the lights stayed on. There was always enough to continue, though rarely enough to feel completely secure. Routine work kept the doors open: oil changes, brake replacements, timing belts, maintenance jobs. The additional income came from salvage vehicles. Owen bought abandoned cars from city auctions, restored them, and sold them for a modest margin. The process required patience, careful judgment, and a willingness to live with uncertainty. Over the previous 3 years, Owen had acquired all three, not because he wanted to. Because life had taught him. 3 years earlier, he had become a widower. His wife Hannah had died in a highway accident on a Tuesday evening in November. The news had arrived with such speed and finality that Owen spent the first year afterward moving through the resulting chaos almost mechanically. Funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, legal documents, phone calls, the endless stream of forms arriving in the mail, neighbors delivering food, conversations he barely remembered having. He handled everything with the focused efficiency of someone whose grief had not yet fully caught up with reality. The real damage appeared later. The way structural cracks emerge weeks after an earthquake, quietly, gradually, in places you don't immediately notice. Rooms felt different, silences became larger. A house designed for 3 people slowly revealed itself as a house occupied by only 2. Owen rarely spoke about Hannah. He didn't display photographs around the shop or invite conversations about loss. He carried it privately. He and his 8-year-old daughter, Mia, lived in a second-floor apartment 6 blocks away from Mercer Automotive. After school, Mia spent most afternoons with her grandmother, Margaret. Margaret was Hannah's mother. Within 3 months of her daughter's death, she had relocated permanently to Hartwell, making it clear she intended to stay. Owen appreciated her presence more than he could easily explain. She had become part of the foundation holding everything together, like a load-bearing beam. Something essential that people often overlook until they imagine life without it. Most evenings, when Mia walked from Margaret's house toward home, she stopped briefly at the shop. She would stand quietly inside whichever bay happened to be open and watch her father work. She never demanded attention, never interrupted, never asked to be entertained, she simply observed. Children raised around skilled labor often develop that habit. They learn that concentration deserves space. The evening Owen brought the Mustang home on a flatbed, Mia arrived wearing her school uniform and carrying her backpack. A half-eaten granola bar rested in one hand. She stopped in the doorway and studied the car. The Mustang sat motionless on the lift. All 4 tires were completely flat. A crack stretched diagonally across the windshield from the lower left corner to the upper right. The driver's side window was gone. Through the opening, the ruined interior was visible, mold-covered surfaces, rotting upholstery, years of neglect. Mia stared at it for several moments, not with disgust, with curiosity. The kind children sometimes possess when they sense an object has a history larger than themselves. At the time, Owen was crouched beneath the rear quarter panel with a flashlight. The frame always came first. A straight frame told the truth. A bent frame lied about everything that followed. Without looking up, he heard Mia standing there. Several seconds passed. Then she asked quietly, "It was pretty once, wasn't it?" Owen guided the flashlight farther along the frame rail. "It will be again." That seemed to satisfy her. She finished the granola bar, wished him good night, and headed back toward Margaret's house. She never asked about the Mustang afterward, and Owen never brought it up. Most nights he worked on the car alone after closing. The bays would go dark one by one. The city outside would settle into evening silence. Only the hum of lights and the occasional metallic sound of tools echoed through the shop. During those long hours, with grease on his hands and nobody watching, Owen slowly realized something. He hadn't purchased the Mustang because of potential profit, not really. The restoration began the way all proper restorations begin, methodically, from the foundation outward. The original 390 cubic inch V8 engine was completely seized after 7 years without movement. Moisture had slipped past the piston rings and bonded rust to the cylinder walls, locking everything in place. For 11 straight days, Owen applied penetrating oil twice daily before the crankshaft finally moved by hand. The carburetor was beyond saving. He sourced a period-correct rebuilt replacement from a specialty supplier in Cincinnati. The fuel system required even more attention. Corrosion had eaten through multiple steel fuel lines, forcing him to replace every section from the fuel tank to the engine bay. There was no reliable way to trust the original lines once 3 separate failures had already revealed themselves. The wiring behind the dashboard presented another challenge. At some point years earlier, part of the harness had suffered an electrical fire. The cloth insulation was brittle, blackened, and fractured. The damage was old enough that the cause could no longer be determined, but the entire affected section had to be rebuilt piece by piece. The front brake calipers were fused solid to the rotors. A reciprocating saw became necessary before he could even inspect the full extent of the damage. The transmission needed more than maintenance. It required a complete rebuild, new bearings, new synchronizers, new seals, everything. Owen recorded every problem in a worn green notebook, 1 line per issue, neat handwriting, precise observations. He never guessed when measurement was possible. He never estimated what could be verified. The habit wasn't about efficiency, it came from experience. He had learned that accuracy at the beginning of a job was what made every step afterward dependable. The discovery happened during the 3rd week. Owen had removed the instrument cluster to begin replacing damaged wiring behind the dashboard. Earlier, during his initial inspection, he had noticed something slightly unusual. The cluster didn't sit perfectly flush. Along the left edge was a gap of perhaps 2 millimeters, small enough to ignore, large enough to notice. At the time, he had assumed decades of age and material shrinkage were responsible. Now, with the cluster removed and sitting beneath a work light on the bench, he looked deeper into the cavity behind it. Something immediately stood out. Factory engineers had not put it there. Mounted between 2 aluminum support members was a rectangular steel plate approximately 8 inches long and 4 inches wide. It was secured with 4 hex head screws of a size that did not match any original factory hardware. The craftsmanship was excellent, the edges were smooth, the welds were clean, no rough grinding. No shortcuts, whoever built it possessed both proper tools and considerable patience. The screws showed light oxidation, evidence of age, but their heads remained remarkably clean. Owen selected the correct driver bit. One by one he removed the screws. Then he lifted the plate free. Behind it sat a section of foam, weather stripping cut with exact precision. Nested inside was a PVC tube roughly 3 inches in diameter. Rubber cap sealed both ends. Electrical tape wrapped every junction. The tape had stiffened with age but remained intact. Owen turned the container over in his hands, then he placed it carefully on the workbench. Using a utility knife, he sliced through the tape. The caps came off. He tipped the contents onto a folded shop rag with deliberate care. Whatever this was, someone had hidden it intentionally. Someone had wanted it found only under very specific circumstances. A black USB drive slid out first. It had been wrapped in protective plastic. Beside it landed a white envelope. Time had yellowed the paper. Small brown spots marked the folds where years had pressed the paper against itself. There was no name written on the front, only a single sentence in handwriting Owen had never seen before. For whoever opens this, please read. He unfolded the letter, 3 pages, blue ballpoint ink, careful block cursive handwriting. The writer began immediately, no introduction, no explanation. His name was Thomas Vance. He was 54 years old. For 2 decades, he had built a construction company alongside his business partner, Sebastian Cole. 6 weeks before writing the letter, Thomas had discovered that Sebastian was secretly altering internal asset transfer contracts. Original signatures were being replaced. Documents were being forged. Company funds were being shifted into a shell corporation called Meridian Logistics Partners. The plan was sophisticated. Sebastian intended to force a controlled bankruptcy while leaving Thomas responsible for the liabilities. Meanwhile, the actual money would disappear beyond the reach of courts, creditors, and investigators. For 6 weeks, Thomas quietly collected evidence. He worked alone after hours. He avoided electronic communication whenever possible. He suspected his conversations were being monitored. He believed Sebastian employed men who asked very few questions. The letter made one thing clear. Thomas wasn't writing because he merely feared something might happen. He was writing because he had realized something already had. Traditional hiding places were useless. Lawyers, filing cabinets, safety deposit boxes, every one of them could be reached by people with enough money, influence, and patience. The safest place for the evidence was somewhere nobody would ever think to search. The safest place was somewhere no one would think to look for something that mattered. He was sorry to ask something of a stranger, he wrote. But if the letter was being read and he was not there, then the car had done what he had asked it to do. The USB contained the original contracts and the altered versions placed side by side. It contained the internal email chain between Sebastian and the chief financial officer. It contained the wire transfer records. It contained everything a lawyer would need to prove what Thomas knew to be true. Alina would fight, he wrote, she would try. She had always been stronger than she understood herself to be, but she could not fight what she could not prove. And Thomas had spent 20 years watching Sebastian Cole understand that better than anyone. Please find her, please give her this. And if you are a good person, which I have to believe you are because the car chose you and Thomas Vance had always trusted it. Car, please do not let it disappear again. Owen plugged the USB into the old laptop in his back office and spent 40 minutes going through the contents methodically. The way he went through a car's systems completely without skipping ahead, without drawing conclusions before he had the full picture. The signature comparison was visible without any specialist equipment. Thomas's actual signature on the original contracts was loose and leftward tilting with a characteristic open break in the capital V, and the forged version on the amended documents was tighter and more vertical with a slight overcorrection of someone copying rather than writing from muscle memory. The email chain ran for 9 weeks between Sebastian and a man identified as the company's chief financial officer, and the language in it was careful about everything except meaning. The kind of correspondence written by people who believed they were being clever and were not quite clever enough. The wire transfer documentation showed 12 transactions from the company operating account to Meridian Logistics Partners across a 6-week window before the bankruptcy filing date totaling $1,800,000. Owen read through the full file twice, closed the laptop, and sat for a long time in the back office with the drop light on and the city quiet outside. He picked up the Polaroid from the bench where he had left it and looked at it. Thomas and Eleanor in summer light. Both of them young enough that the years ahead of them still looked like a road rather than a record. Thomas's hand flat on the roof of his car. Eleanor leaning into him, laughing at something that had just been said. On the back of the Polaroid in Thomas's hand, your first car and the first time you understood why. Owen set the photograph down. He found Thomas Vance's obituary in 4 minutes through the Tribune's online archive. November 9, 2017, 54 years old, survived by his wife, Alina. He found the bankruptcy filing for Vance and Cole Construction, dated October 2017. He found the property record for 14 Elmage Drive showing a distress sale in February 2, 2018. He found no current address, no active phone, no trace of Alina Vance anywhere a search could reach in the present tense. He found her through the bankruptcy court docket, which was a public record filed with the county clerk. The filings listed a secondary legal contact address for Aliner's correspondence during the proceedings. Holloway Bookkeeping, a small accounting firm on the northwest side of Hartwell, off a road that Owen knew from a supply run he used to make years ago. He drove there on a Tuesday afternoon and walked in without an appointment. The front office was a two-room space with two desks, and a row of filing cabinets and a receptionist who looked up with the practiced attentiveness of someone whose job required her to manage access. Owen asked if she had a contact method for Ellen Vance. The receptionist became careful in the way people become careful around a name they have been instructed to protect. Owen placed his business card on the counter. He said, "I bought a 1967 Mustang at the City Impound auction 8 weeks ago. It belonged to her husband. I believe there is something inside it that was meant for her to have." He said nothing beyond that. He went back to the shop and worked until the light failed and then drove home. Alina Vance called at 2:15 the following afternoon. Her voice on the phone was even and controlled, and beneath the control was a quality Owen recognized, not as coldness but as discipline. The voice of someone who had learned that letting things through had a cost, and who had managed that cost by deciding carefully what she allowed to reach the surface. She asked him specific questions about where the car had been, how long he had owned it, what he meant by something meant for her. Owen answered each question fully and added nothing extra. When she asked for the address of the shop, he gave it. She arrived 2 hours later, and Owen watched her stand in the bay doorway and look at the Mustang the way you look at something you loved before the world changed the terms under which you were allowed to love it. Eleanor Vance was 54 years old, and she wore her graying hair straight and plain, and she had the posture of someone who had been a person of standing once and had refused, through every subsequent difficulty, to let that person depart entirely from the way she held herself. She stood in the doorway, looking at the stripped and partially restored Mustang for nearly 10 seconds without speaking. Owen did not fill the silence. He brought the Polaroid from the workbench and set it in front of her. She picked it up with both hands and looked at it in the way you look at something you had disciplined yourself not to picture anymore. Then he set the envelope beside it. She sat down on the rolling stool and read Thomas's letter from the first line to the last, turning each page with the care of someone reading a contract who cannot afford to miss a word. When she set the final page flat on the bench, she held the silence for a moment, and then she told Owen what had happened after November 9, 2017. Not as appeal or performance, but as inventory, the way a careful person accounts for damage after the fact. Sebastian Cole's attorneys had arrived within 2 weeks of the funeral with 4 in of documents. She had no access to the company accounts, no liquid assets, no legal representation of her own. She had signed the settlement because the alternative was a court fight against resources she could not match and could not sustain. She lost the house. She lost the company. She lost what Thomas had spent 20 years building. She had filed civil suits in 2019 and 2021, and both had been dismissed on evidentiary grounds. She had continued working accounting support, bookkeeping contracts enough to live on without comfort, because the alternative to continuing was not something she had allowed herself to consider. 7 years, she said, her voice was level and quiet. I knew what he did. I was never able to prove what I knew. Owen reached across the bench and set the USB drive on the wood beside her hand. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and closed her hand around it. And for a moment, she did not look like a woman who had spent 7 years outside her own story. She looked like a woman who had just been handed the key to the door she had been standing at for all that time. Sebastian Cole was 58 years old and occupied the 14th floor of a building in downtown Hartwell with his name on a brushed steel placard beside the entrance. Cole Development Group had grown with methodical consistency in the years since 2017. Commercial properties, city infrastructure contracts, a charitable foundation that had generated 2 civic combination plaques currently displayed in the corridor outside his office. He wore charcoal suits and wore them well, and he spoke at a controlled register that never varied enough to reveal anything he had not chosen to reveal. He was a man who had understood early that visible calm was the most expensive resource available to him, and he had invested in it with the kind of discipline that most people reserved for other things. He kept a locked drawer in his desk. Inside it was a piece of paper in his own handwriting with 7 items listed in blue ink. 6 of them had been crossed through with a single clean horizontal line. The Thomas Vance Mustang 67. He had been looking for that car through carefully managed intermediaries since 2018. And he had not found it because a city impound lot in Ohio does not maintain the kind of searchable database that connects easily to the name of a man who paid a floor bid at a quarterly auction with a business check and drove away without advertising the transaction. He had nearly stopped looking. The item on the list had begun to feel like the kind of risk that diminishes through time rather than growing, and he had almost convinced himself that the car had been crushed years ago, or stripped for parts, and the evidence it might have contained scattered across the state's waste stream. And then on a Thursday morning, his information source called. He learned about Owen Mercer in a 3S sentence report. A mechanic at a shop called Mercer Automotive was completing a full restoration of a 1967 Mustang Fastback in Needham, and this mechanic had recently located Eleanor Vance and met with her at the shop. Sebastian received this information without any visible response. He thanked the source and ended the call. He opened the locked drawer and looked at the list for a moment. Then he made one call, and by the following day, Adrian Walsh was in a charcoal sedan pulling up to Mercer Automotive with a prepared offer and a clear instruction about what he was authorized to spend. Adrian was 45 years old, a private attorney who had worked for Sebastian's interests for 11 years, and who had learned over those 11 years that the structure of their arrangement was built on his not asking certain questions. He introduced himself to Owen with professional smoothness, described his client as a long-standing enthusiast of American classic vehicles, and offered $30,000 for the unfinished Mustang. The offer moved to $35,000 and then to $50,000 when Owen declined it a second time. And Owen looked at Adrian Walsh across the workbench, with the specific expression of a man who knows what a number means when it is disproportionate to the thing it is supposedly buying. He said Adrian left a business card. Owen looked at the card after the sedan had gone and thought about what $50,000 actually communicated. It did not communicate desire for a car. It communicated the need to make a problem disappear before someone with the right kind of attention could examine it. That evening, Owen took the USB from the locked toolbox and drove it home. The break-in happened on Monday. Owen arrived at 6:45 to find the side door of the shop standing open, the lock pried with something narrow and competent that left the door frame undamaged. The kind of entry that signals training rather than desperation. Nothing was missing, everything had been searched. The tool cabinet drawers pulled to the stop and returned at angles slightly different from how Owen kept them, the filing cabinet standing open with the folders disturbed. The rolling stool positioned 2 feet from its usual place. The search had been methodical and unhurried, and had been conducted by someone who either did not care whether Owen knew they had been there or wanted him to know. Owen stood in the middle of the bay for a long time looking at the room without touching anything. He did not call the police. He understood the calculus of that decision clearly and made it without drama. He locked up and went to work. 2 days after the break-in, a city inspector arrived with a violations list that included 3 items that had not existed at Owen's last compliance review 6 months prior. Items that were technically addressable but would require documentation, remediation time, and inspection fees that had not been budgeted. The morning after the inspector's visit, his bank called about a scheduled review of his equipment loan that had not previously been indicated as pending, and that would require updated financial documentation within 10 business days. Within 4 days of that call, 3 of his regular clients sent brief cancellation messages with no explanation attached, each message arriving within the same narrow window of time as the others. Owen tracked all of it in his notebook alongside the mechanical entries, 1 line per event dated. He was not the kind of man who catastrophized, and he was not frightened. But he was clear-eyed about what a pattern of 4 coordinated pressures in 8 days meant. Someone with institutional reach was applying it systematically through channels that left each individual action technically unattributable. Sebastian came himself on Thursday afternoon. He did not call ahead. He knocked on the open bay door with 2 knuckles and walked in with the proprietary ease of a man who had spent 30 years moving through spaces as if they already belonged to him. He sat down in the client's folding chair beside Owen's desk, a metal chair on stained concrete, a working garage that smelled of oil and rubber. And he settled into it, the way he would have settled into a leather chair in a conference room with the complete comfort of someone who does not register physical circumstance as something that changes the terms. His suit was charcoal and impeccable. His watch was silver and understated and cost more than Owen's monthly equipment payment. He looked around the shop with the mild interest of someone observing rather than evaluating. And then he looked at Owen with an expression that contained warmth in the way that certain very cold things contain warmth as a surface property, not a source. You have built something real here. Sebastian said, Hartwell needs people who do real work. I want to make sure you are still here 5 years from now doing it. He said it in a tone that was not a threat in any way that could be quoted back to him. He let those two sentences sit in the air between them. He waited. Owen stood beside the Mustang with his arms at his sides and looked at Sebastian and did not speak. Sebastian held the silence for another measured interval, then stood, smoothed his jacket over his shirt and walked to the door. He was in the shop for less than 4 minutes. Owen listened to the car door close and the engine start and the tires roll off the lot. And he stood alone in the bay and understood two things. That whatever was on the USB drive, Sebastian needed it badly enough to appear in person, and that appearing in person meant the other approaches had not produced what he required. Owen went to the back office, opened the laptop, and began to work. He drove to meet Alina that evening in the parking area of a small public park, 2 blocks from the bookkeeping office, and they sat in Owen's truck with the engine off. He walked her through the USB files on the laptop, document by document, the contracts first, the originals beside the altered versions. The signature differences visible to any careful eye without any specialist tool, just attention and the willingness to sit with what you were looking at. Then the email chain. Then the wire transfer records. Alina read each document completely, turning the laptop toward her, leaning forward slightly with the same slow and total attention she had given Thomas's letter. When she had been through all of it, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked through the windshield at the park, where the evening was settling gray in the trees along the far edge. He built this for me, she said. Her voice was quiet, and the quiet had a different quality than the controlled quiet Owen had heard from her before. This was not management. This was a woman hearing a truth that had been waiting for her. He knew what was coming, and he built me something to survive it, she said. I just came late. Owen looked at her. Then we are not late. He said we are on time. Eleanor turned and looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, what was in her eyes was not the residue of damage but something that moved forward. That night, Owen organized the files into 3 complete and identical documentation packages at the kitchen table. He wrote a brief explanatory note for each one describing the provenance of the materials and the circumstances under which they had been found, and he sent all 3 packages before midnight. The first went to Grace Holloway at the Hartwell Tribune. He had found her through the paper's digital archive, where a 4-part investigative series she had written in 2021 on inflated municipal land contracts still live specific sourced and productive. Having generated 2 formal state-level inquiries and 1 mayoral commission report. She was 28 years old and had stayed at a regional paper when she could have left, which told Owen that she was either principled or stubborn or both. And in either case, she was someone who would not mishandle what he was about to send her. The second package went to the Ohio Division of Securities Enforcement through the public submission portal on their website. The third went to Alina's attorney, who had agreed to review the case under a contingency arrangement after Eleanor called him. Following their evening in the parking area, Owen sent all 3, closed the laptop, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and went to bed without telling Sebastian anything, without warning him. Without offering him any of the renegotiation that a different kind of person might have attempted. He had spent enough time around engines to understand that the moment you start negotiating with a leak rather than fixing it, the leak wins. Grace Holloway called on a Friday, 4 days after Owen sent the files. She had engaged an independent forensic document examiner in Dayton who had previously testified in 3 state fraud cases. And the examiner had confirmed in a written preliminary assessment that the signatures on the altered contracts were inconsistent with Thomas Vance's authenticated signature samples drawn from deeds, annual tax filings, and other dated notarized documents. She had also located the former chief financial officer of Vance and Cole Construction, who had relocated to Tucson after the company's dissolution and who had declined an on-record interview, but had given a lengthy background conversation after learning that documentary evidence from the company files already existed. A conversation that Grace described as detailed, specific, and consistent with the documentary record. She asked Owen if he wanted attribution. He said no. She said she would describe the source only as a Hartwell mechanic who purchased the vehicle at a city impound auction 7 years after it was abandoned. He said that was accurate. She asked if he had any other documentation that had not yet been shared. He said he had sent everything. The article published the following Monday morning across all editions of the Hartwell Tribune, print and digital simultaneously under a headline that did not qualify itself or hedge its claims. Coal Development and the Structured Bankruptcy of 2017, Evidence from Fromgetton Car. Owen read it once at his workbench before opening the shop for the day. He read it with the careful attention he gave to a completed repair before signing off on it. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to the Mustang. He was working on the Nighthawk Blue. The original factory color code had not been in regular production since 1968, and the modern reproduction paints only approximated it. They either read too green in daylight or too dark indoors, and none of them had the quality of depth that the factory finish had possessed, where the colors seemed to exist inside the surface rather than on top of it. Owen had found a solution that cost him 2 extra days and was technically beyond what any paying restoration client would have authorized. He had identified a surviving panel of original factory finish under the rear wheel well, protected for 57 years by a rubber trim piece that had sealed it from everything the weather and the years had done to the rest of the car. He had removed the panel and taken it to an auto body specialty supplier who had the equipment for spectral color analysis. And the supplier had custom mixed a formula matched to the factory pigment chemistry within tolerances that the supplier himself had said were closer than he had achieved on anything in recent memory. Owen had sprayed the color onto a test panel first, held it in morning light and afternoon light and the flat fluorescent light of the shop. And when all three matched his memory of what the car had looked like in the Polaroid photograph, he had begun applying it to the bodywork. He was not doing this because a client had asked for it. He was doing it because it was the right color, and the car was going to have the right color, and that was the end of the consideration. The civic response to Grace Holloway's article moved through Hartwell in stages over the following weeks. The city council called an emergency session and requested Sebastian Cole's voluntary recusal from 2 advisory positions pending review. The Hartwell Civic Foundation, the charitable organization Sebastian had chaired for 6 years, for which he had received commendations in 2020 and 2022, suspended his membership pending the outcome of the investigation. 3 of his commercial development partners released public statements, pausing their collaborative projects pending clarification. The Ohio Division of Securities Enforcement confirmed in a brief statement that it had opened a preliminary investigation into the matters described in the published report. A publicly traded subsidiary of Coal Development Group declined 17% over 2 trading sessions following the article's publication. Sebastian Cole issued a single statement through new legal counsel, characterizing the allegations as baseless and politically motivated in the documentary evidence as selectively presented, and he was not seen publicly in Hartwell in the 2 weeks that followed. Adrian Walsh appeared in a legal trade notice as having transitioned to private consulting. The name Sebastian Cole, which had occupied a particular kind of settled authority in Hartwell for years. The kind that stops being questioned because it has not been questioned in so long that the questioning itself seems impolite, began to move in the conversations of the city. From the column of established facts to the column of open questions. This is a slower process than it sounds, but it is in the end irreversible. 3 months after the article published, the Ohio Division of Securities Enforcement filed a formal civil complaint against Sebastian Cole, citing fraudulent asset transfer, material misrepresentation in bankruptcy proceedings, and conspiracy to defraud a creditor of approximately $1,800,000. A parallel criminal referral was forwarded to the county prosecutor's office the same week. Coal Development Group was placed under a court-ordered compliance monitor pending the resolution of the civil proceedings. Aliner's lawsuit was refiled with the complete documentary record attached and was accepted on first review without dismissal scheduled for a preliminary hearing in the new year. Her attorney told her privately, after reviewing the state's filing, that the forensic certification of the altered signatures, in combination with the electronic documentary record, gave the civil case foundation that neither of the 2 previous filings had come close to possessing. Eleanor told him she understood. She asked how long it would take. He said it would take time. She told him she had experience with that. The Mustang was finished on a Friday afternoon in late November, 9 weeks after Owen had paid $2,000 for it at the city auction floor. Night mist blew from the roof rails to the rocker panels exactly right in every light. The chrome rebuilt piece by piece and replated. The black leather interior cut and sewn to the factory pattern with a quality of seamwork that would not have been out of place on the original production line. The engine running at a pitch that was clean and authoritative without any trace of roughness. Sound of a machine that had been built correctly and had been returned to that condition. Owen drove it twice around the block after closing the bay doors, windows down in the cold November air, listening for anything that was not right. There was nothing that was not right. He pulled back into the bay, turned off the engine, and sat in the car for a moment in the particular quiet that follows the completion of a long job. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of something finished. He drove to Holloway Bookkeeping that afternoon without calling ahead and parked the Mustang at the curb directly in front of the glass door. He walked in and the receptionist looked up from her desk. Owen asked if she could let Mrs. Vance know there was someone at the front for her. He waited near the door. Eleanor came out from the back corridor 2 minutes later holding a manila folder and a pen, and she stopped when she saw Owen standing there. And then her eyes moved past him through the glass door to the street and she stopped again. The folder and the pen stayed in her hands, but she was not looking at them. She walked to the door and pushed it open with her shoulder and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon light in late November in Ohio falls low and at a slant. And at 4:00, it was hitting the hood of the Mustang at an angle that turned the night mist blue luminous in the specific way that color behaves in that particular quality of autumn light. The way it seems lit from inside rather than from outside. The way Thomas must have seen it every time he drove it in a season like this. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk and looked at the car for a long time. Owen held the key out toward her. She looked at it in his hand. She took it. She walked to the car and placed her open hand flat on the hood, right side, slightly forward of center, which was the exact position of Thomas's hand in the Polaroid photograph. Owen did not say this. He did not know if she was placing her hand there consciously or by some instinct that bypassed thought. He stood 2 paces back and did not speak because he had learned over many years of this work that some moments are diminished by being described, while they are still happening, and this was one of those moments. After a long interval without turning to face him, Eleanor said, "Thank you." Owen said it was always yours. The city inspector did not return to Mercer Automotive for a follow-up visit. The bank confirmed Owen's loan terms without modification after he submitted the documentation they had requested. The 3 clients who had canceled rebooked their appointments without explanation or acknowledgement, and Owen scheduled them without comment. 1 month after the article published, a man called the shop and asked whether Owen took on classic restoration work. He had read about the Hartwell mechanic who had restored a Mustang from the city impound, and he had a '69 Camaro in a garage in Medina that had been sitting for 4 years. Owen wrote down the information and said he would call back. The shop continued as it had before, covering its costs and requiring attention and not offering the kind of breathing room that allowed for complacency. This was not a transformation. It was the modest and specific consequence of doing something correctly, the world adjusting slightly in the direction of what was deserved without announcement or ceremony. One evening near the end of November, Owen came home to find Mia at the kitchen table under the lamp with her homework spread around her. She looked up when he came in and after a moment asked whether the woman had liked the car. Owen hung his jacket on the peg by the door and thought about this. "I don't know if she was happy," he said, "but she is not standing on the outside of her own story anymore." Mia considered this with the concentrated seriousness she brought to things she understood better than she could say, then nodded and went back to her work. Owen went to the kitchen and started dinner. Later that night, after the apartment had gone quiet, Owen sat at the small desk in the corner of the living room and took the manila envelope from the bottom drawer. Inside it were the Polaroid photograph and a scanned copy of Thomas's letter. The original was with Eleanor's attorney as part of the evidentiary file where it belonged. Owen looked at the photograph for a long time. Thomas Vance in the summer light of some year that predated everything that had happened since. His hand on the roof of the car he loved, laughing at something just out of frame. A man who had understood in the worst weeks of his life that the safest thing he could do was trust the world to produce someone capable, or of carrying what he left behind. He had built the compartment carefully and sealed it well, and set his piece on 3 pages of lined notebook paper, and then he had driven the car into the ordinary world and trusted. Owen put the photograph back in the envelope and set it in the drawer. He turned off the lamp. There are things that move slowly in this world, accumulating weight the way sediment accumulates, invisible in any single day, readable only in what the years eventually reveal. Thomas Vance had understood this, and he had built accordingly, not for the short timeline, not for the fast resolution, but for the durable one. A mechanic from Ohio had bought a forgotten car at the floor bid one October morning. Something he could not name told him to stop walking, and the car had done what Thomas had asked it to do. Owen had done his part of the job, the rest was moving forward the way things move. When the foundation is finally right, he turned off the light and went to